What if the most explosive moment of the 2026 Sundance Film Festival didn't happen on stage, but behind a closed door in a hallway where no one thought the walls would talk? That's the question nobody in Park City wanted to answer that night. And yet, by dawn, it was the only thing anyone could think about, because something happened after the event. Something raw, something loud enough to stop people mid-step. Something so unexpected that even seasoned Sundance veterans would later say, quietly, "I've never seen that before." Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. An argument, overheard, unfiltered. And at the center of it, the organizer of the 2026 Sundance Film Festival, Eugene Hernandez, and Meghan Markle, two figures who represent very different kinds of power, colliding in a moment that would ripple far beyond that night. Here's what makes this story uncomfortable. It wasn't supposed to be public. There were no cameras, no microphones, no red carpet smiles, just voices, raised voices. And one sentence reportedly spoken with finality that froze the room. "You can't bully my staff." But let's rewind, because to understand why that line landed like a thunderclap, you have to understand what Sundance had become by 22/6, and why tensions were already stretched thin before that door ever closed. Sundance, once the scrappy indie darling of Hollywood, was in a fragile moment. The industry was changing fast. Streaming had rewritten the rules. Celebrities now arrived with entourages larger than some production teams. And the festival, desperate to remain relevant without losing its soul, was walking a tightrope. Ask yourself this: how do you honor independent voices while catering to global fame? How do you protect your staff when the guest list includes people used to never hearing no? That tension was already in the air when Meghan Markle arrived. Her presence alone shifted the gravity of the event. Staff noticed it immediately. Security protocols tightened. Schedules became fluid. Whispers traveled faster than official memos. For some, it was exciting. For others, exhausting. And that's where the story really begins. Not with shouting, but with strain. By mid-evening, the atmosphere backstage was brittle. Volunteers had been on their feet for hours. Coordinators were juggling last-minute changes. One request became two. Two became four. And each one came with the unspoken assumption that accommodation was expected. But what happens when accommodation hits a boundary? Witnesses would later describe a moment, small on the surface, where a request was denied, politely, professionally, quietly. No scene, no disrespect, just a "we can't do that." If you've ever worked an event like this, you know how loaded those words can be. From there, accounts diverge. Some say frustration had been building all day. Others insist the disagreement escalated suddenly, like a match to dry grass. What everyone agrees on is this: the energy shifted. People nearby sensed it before they heard it. Conversations trailed off, eyes flicked toward a corridor not meant for drama. And then came the voices. Not screaming, not yet. Firm. Controlled, then sharper. Imagine being a junior staffer in that moment. Do you look away? Do you pretend you hear nothing? Do you step in or pray someone else does? Because here's the thing, Sundance staff understand better than most. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it leans in close and speaks softly, and that can be more intimidating than yelling. That's why what happened next mattered so much. According to multiple accounts, Eugene Hernandez entered the situation not as a negotiator, but as a line drawer. And that distinction is everything. Festivals are used to smoothing things over, to de-escalation, to compromise. This wasn't that. This was a moment where someone in charge decided the line had already been crossed. Why does that matter? Because in Hollywood, staff are often invisible until they become collateral. And saying, "my staff" out loud, in defense, is not standard operating procedure. Ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you heard a festival leader publicly, or even privately, confront a global figure over how staff are treated? Exactly. The confrontation, as described, wasn't theatrical. No grand gestures, no profanity-laced tirades. That's almost what made it more shocking. The calmness, the clarity. And Meghan Markle's reaction? That's where the story becomes complicated. Some witnesses claim she appeared stunned, not angry, but caught off guard. Others say she pushed back, asserting expectations she believed were reasonable. A few insist the disagreement wasn't about bullying at all, but about miscommunication inflated by stress. So which version is true? That question would haunt Sundance corridors for days, because here's the contradiction no one could ignore. Meghan Markle is a public advocate against mistreatment. Her brand is rooted in empathy, empowerment, and calling out toxic dynamics. So how does that square with an accusation, even implied, of bullying staff? Was it a misunderstanding, a clash of cultural expectations, or a moment where power dynamics revealed something uncomfortable on both sides? By the time the voices stopped, something had already broken. Not publicly, not officially, but socially, people knew they'd witnessed something they weren't meant to. And the silence afterward was louder than the argument itself. No statements, no leaks, no clarifications, which only made the whispers louder. By the next morning, staff were exchanging looks instead of words. Industry insiders asked careful questions that went unanswered. And somewhere between breakfast meetings and panel discussions, the story began to mutate. Because when Hollywood doesn't get a narrative, it invents one. Some framed Hernandez as a hero standing up for workers. Others painted him as reckless for confronting a high-profile guest. Meghan's silence became a Rorschach test, interpreted as dignity by some, guilt by others. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Nobody outside that room knows exactly what was said. And yet, everyone feels entitled to decide what it meant. That's why this moment refuses to fade. It isn't just about an argument. It's about who gets protected, who gets challenged, and who is expected to absorb pressure quietly so the show can go on. And if you think this ended with that night, think again. Because what happened next, behind closed doors in meetings that never made the schedule, would force Sundance to confront a question it had avoided for years. Is relevance worth silence? Or, to put it more bluntly, how much power is too much power, even for Sundance? And just when everyone thought the story would stay buried in whispers, a single detail began circulating. A detail that suggested this confrontation wasn't spontaneous at all. It had been coming, and once you understand why, everything changes. Got it? I'm locked in and ready. Did you ever notice how the most important moments never happen where the spotlight is? They happen in hallways, in pauses, in the seconds after a door closes and before anyone decides what version of the truth they're going to tell. Because the night Sundance held its breath didn't start with raised voices. It started with silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong. If you had been there, really there, you would have felt it before you understood it. A subtle tightening in the air, conversations ending a little too quickly. Staff members exchanging glances that said more than any whisper could. Something was off and everyone knew it, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. And that's how moments like this are born. Not in chaos, in restraint. This was supposed to be a routine evening at the 26 Sundance Film Festival. The kind of night Sundance has perfected over decades. Polished panels, carefully curated appearances, polite applause, quiet exits. On paper, nothing extraordinary. In reality, everything was already leaning toward a breaking point. Because Sundance in 2026 wasn't just hosting films. It was hosting expectations. Expectations from studios desperate for relevance. Expectations from celebrities accustomed to control. Expectations from staff who had been asked, again and again, to do more with less. And expectations, when they collide, don't make noise at first. They grind. Ask anyone who works behind the scenes at a major festival. They'll tell you the same thing. The danger isn't the big demands, it's the small ones that keep stacking up until someone finally says, "We can't." That word had already been said earlier that night, quietly, politely, professionally. And that, according to more than one person who was there, is where the clock really started ticking. By the time Meghan Markle arrived at the event, the machinery was already running hot. Security had shifted into a higher gear. Schedules were rewritten in real time. Staff who thought they were done for the night were told to stay just in case. Smiles stayed fixed, but shoulders tightened. If you're wondering why her presence changed the temperature so dramatically, here's the uncomfortable answer. Not because of who she is, but because of what she represents. Global attention, narrative risk, zero margin for error. Every move suddenly mattered. Every interaction felt loaded. And for staff, many of them young, underpaid, and painfully aware of how replaceable they are, the pressure wasn't abstract. It was physical. Feet aching, phones buzzing, instructions coming from 3 directions at once. At some point, a request came through. Not outrageous, not unheard of. Just complicated enough to require bending a rule. Or 2. Or maybe 3. This is where stories start to split. Some witnesses say the request itself wasn't the problem. Others insist it crossed a line Sundance had already decided not to cross this year. What everyone agrees on is that a staff member, a real person, not a faceless role, was put in the position of having to say no. Have you ever been that person? The one standing between power and policy? The one who knows that whatever you say, you're going to carry it alone. The refusal, as described, was calm. No attitude, no scene, just an explanation, a boundary. And then came the pause. That dangerous pause where no one knows whether the moment will pass or explode. What happened next didn't unfold in front of cameras. It happened off to the side, in a corridor meant for logistics, not legend. People nearby didn't see everything. They didn't need to. They heard enough. At first, the voices were low, controlled, tense, the kind of tone people use when they're trying very hard not to make a scene. But tension doesn't stay contained forever. It leaks. Someone walking past slowed down. Someone else stopped entirely. A volunteer froze with a clipboard in their hands, unsure whether to retreat or remain invisible. This wasn't supposed to be happening. Not here, not like this. And then, stepping into that charged space, was the one person who could actually change the trajectory of the night, Eugene Hernandez. Up until that moment, Hernandez had been what Sundance needed him to be: composed, strategic, careful. A leader navigating an impossible balance between art, industry, and image. But leadership has a way of revealing itself when plans collapse. What's often left out of neat press narratives is that festival directors rarely confront guests directly. Problems are delegated, smoothed over, handled quietly by intermediaries whose job is to absorb impact so the brand doesn't have to. That didn't happen here. Instead, Hernandez listened. Accounts differ on how long he stood there before speaking. Some say seconds. Others say it felt longer. What's consistent is the shift people felt when he finally did. This wasn't de-escalation. This wasn't negotiation. This was a line being drawn. When the words came, the now infamous words, they weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. The calmness was the point. You can't bully my staff. If you've ever been in a room where power dynamics suddenly reverse, you know the feeling. The air changes. People stop breathing normally. Someone, somewhere, realizes this moment will be remembered, even if no one ever admits it happened. Now, here's where the story becomes uncomfortable for everyone involved, because that sentence doesn't exist in a vacuum. To say it implies something had already gone too far. But what does too far mean when no one agrees on where the line is? One person's insistence is another person's entitlement. One person's boundary is another person's inconvenience. And then there's the contradiction no one wants to talk about. Meghan Markle's public image is built on speaking out against mistreatment, on calling out systems that silence and pressure people behind the scenes. So how does that reconcile with an accusation, even an implied one, of bullying? Was it a misunderstanding magnified by exhaustion and stress? Was it a clash of expectations shaped by very different worlds? Or was it a moment where even carefully managed personas cracked under pressure? People who were there describe her reaction in conflicting ways. Some say she appeared genuinely taken aback, as if the accusation hadn't even occurred to her. Others claim she defended her position firmly, insisting she hadn't crossed any lines. No yelling, no meltdown, just tension thick enough to choke on. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. No dramatic exit. No slammed doors, just separation. Someone walked away, someone else stayed behind. And everyone who had witnessed even a fragment of it knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wasn't over. Because when an incident like this happens at Sundance, the real fallout doesn't come immediately. It comes later. In meetings, in silence, in who stops returning messages. That night, there was no official acknowledgement, no damage control statement, no spin. And that absence spoke volumes. Staff went home buzzing with adrenaline and dread. Industry insiders woke up the next morning to whispers that sounded too specific to be rumor and too vague to be confirmed. People started asking careful questions, the kind you ask when you don't want your curiosity traced back to you. Meanwhile, Meghan Markle said nothing. No clarification, no denial, no statement of support for staff. And in Hollywood, silence is never neutral. Was it strategy? Was it shock? Or was it confidence that the story would die quietly if left alone? As for Eugene Hernandez, those close to him noticed a change. Subtle, but real. Fewer offhand jokes, longer pauses before answering questions. A sense that something irreversible had occurred, not publicly, but internally. Because here's the truth, Sundance would never put in a press release. Once you draw a line like that, you don't get to erase it. You've declared what you'll tolerate and what you won't. The problem? Not everyone in Hollywood appreciates being told no. By the end of the week, one thing was clear. This confrontation had become a Rorschach test. People saw what they wanted to see. A brave stand. An unnecessary escalation. A misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But buried beneath all of it was a quieter question. No one seemed ready to answer. Had this confrontation been building long before Meghan Markle ever arrived? Because as details slowly began to surface, a troubling pattern emerged. This wasn't the first time staff had raised concerns. It wasn't the first time boundaries were tested. And it definitely wasn't the first warning Sundance leadership had received. Which raises the question that would soon dominate private conversations: what if this wasn't a single incident at all, but the moment everything finally boiled over? And if that's true, then the fight everyone overheard was only the surface crack. The real fracture was already underneath. And what came next, behind closed doors, far from public view, would make it impossible for Sundance to pretend this was just another rumor. Who actually runs Sundance when the cameras are off? That's the question people started asking in hushed tones after the night everything cracked. Not out loud, not on record, just quietly over coffee that went cold while phones stayed face down on tables. Because once you accept that the confrontation wasn't random, that it may have been building for weeks, even months, the story stops being about a single argument. It becomes about power. Invisible power. The kind that doesn't have a badge or a title, but still decides who gets accommodated, who gets ignored, and who is expected to absorb pressure without complaint. Sundance likes to project an image of equality, indie spirit, collaborative culture, everyone here for the art. And on the surface, that's true. But beneath that polished veneer is a hierarchy so subtle most outsiders never notice it. Until something breaks. Here's what most people don't understand about festivals like Sundance. Authority is fragmented by design. There is no single lever you pull to make things happen. Decisions are distributed across departments, committees, coordinators, liaisons, and temporary staff. That fragmentation is supposed to protect the institution. If no one person holds all the power, no one person becomes the villain. But fragmentation has a side effect. When pressure comes from above or from outside, it rarely lands on the people with titles. It lands on the ones closest to the ground. Volunteers, assistants, junior coordinators, the people whose names never appear in credits. By 2006, that system was under strain. Sundance had expanded its reach, its guest list, its global footprint. More attention meant more demands. More demands meant more improvisation. And improvisation done too often becomes expectation. That's the part no one likes to admit. Once you bend a rule quietly, it becomes precedent. Once you make an exception without documentation, it becomes entitlement. Staff had been feeling that shift long before this incident. Requests that used to come through formal channels started arriving informally. Changes that once required approval were suddenly assumed. The phrase, "just make it work," became a default instruction. Ask yourself, how long can anyone operate like that before something gives? Behind the scenes, some staff had started raising concerns. Not dramatic complaints, not accusations, just observations. Notes in internal communications, questions in meetings that ended with awkward silence. What happens if we say no? Who backs us if someone pushes back? Those questions didn't always get answered. And that's where the real power imbalance lived. Not in any single celebrity, but in the uncertainty staff felt about whether the institution would protect them if things got uncomfortable. So when that refusal happened on the night in question, it didn't exist in isolation. It landed on top of weeks of accumulated stress. Think about that moment again. A staff member says no, calmly, correctly, according to policy. And suddenly, the unspoken test begins. Will the system support them? Or will it quietly override them to keep things smooth? This is where leadership matters. People close to the situation say the decision not to override that staffer wasn't spontaneous. It reflected a shift that had been happening internally, a growing recognition that the festival couldn't keep absorbing pressure without consequence. But here's the irony. The very system designed to diffuse power had made it easier for pressure to build unnoticed. Because when no single person feels responsible, everyone feels responsible. And that leads to hesitation, delay, silence. By the time the confrontation happened, Sundance leadership wasn't reacting to one moment, they were responding to a pattern. The problem? That pattern was invisible to most guests. From the outside, everything still looked seamless. Smiling staff, efficient transitions, applause on cue. Guests rarely see the strain because festivals are designed to hide it. So when boundaries suddenly appeared, they felt abrupt, unreasonable, even personal. Imagine being used to a world where logistics bend around you, where access is fluid, where your presence changes the rules without you ever having to ask. Then imagine encountering a space where someone finally says, "Not here." That's not just inconvenient, it's destabilizing. And destabilization is often mistaken for disrespect. This is where interpretations diverge sharply. Some insiders argue the confrontation was inevitable, a necessary correction in a system that had drifted too far toward accommodation at the expense of its people. Others insist it was mishandled, that leadership failed to anticipate how a refusal would land with a high-profile guest accustomed to different norms. Both can be true. That's the uncomfortable part. Power isn't just about dominance, it's about expectation, about what you assume will happen next because it always has before. For staff, the expectation had been clear for years. Adapt quietly. For guests, the expectation was just as clear. Things get handled. When those expectations collide, someone has to lose. The question Sundance found itself facing wasn't whether the confrontation was justified, it was whether it was sustainable. Because once you assert authority publicly, or even semi-privately, in a way that spreads, you can't unassert it. You can't go back to a world where rules are optional for some and mandatory for others. And that realization sent ripples through the organization. In the days that followed, meetings were held that never appeared on schedules. Conversations happened in offices with doors closed. People spoke carefully, choosing words like alignment and long-term vision. But beneath the corporate language was a raw fear. What if this changes how people see us? What if it scares away talent? What if it empowers staff to say no more often? That last question hung in the air longer than anyone liked, because saying no is contagious. Once one person does it, and is supported, others start to believe they can too. And belief is dangerous in systems built on quiet compliance. Meanwhile, the silence from the other side only intensified speculation. No clarification, no reassurance. No acknowledgement of staff concerns. For some, that silence felt strategic. For others, dismissive. And for Sundance staff watching all of this unfold, it raised a new question entirely. If leadership was willing to draw a line this publicly, what lines had already been crossed before this moment? That's when stories started surfacing. Not accusations, not scandals, just recollections. Moments that felt small at the time but now took on new meaning. A request that made someone uncomfortable, a tone that felt dismissive, a situation where staff felt pressured to comply without backup. Individually, none of these moments would make headlines. Together, they painted a picture of a system stretched thin. And suddenly, the confrontation wasn't about one person at all. It was about who Sundance was willing to protect when the cost of protection was friction. That's a dangerous precedent in Hollywood, because friction is usually avoided at all costs. Smoothness is rewarded. Discomfort is outsourced. By choosing friction, even briefly, Sundance disrupted a long-standing unspoken agreement, and not everyone was happy about it. Behind the scenes, phone calls were made, relationships quietly assessed, invitations reconsidered, nothing explicit, nothing traceable, just a recalibration. The kind that happens when power feels challenged. And that's when a new fear emerged within Sundance itself. What if this wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something larger? Because as one insider would later say, off the record, once people realized we were willing to say that out loud, everything changed. Everything. Staff felt emboldened. Leadership felt exposed. And guests began to wonder what would and wouldn't be tolerated next, which leads to the question no one wanted to ask yet. If Sundance had finally drawn a line, how many people had already crossed it before anyone noticed? And more importantly, who was next? Because just as internal conversations intensified, something unexpected began to happen outside the festival. The whispers weren't staying inside anymore. They were leaking. And the version of the story traveling through Hollywood was starting to take on a life of its own. one that Sundance could no longer control. And when that narrative reached the wrong ears, the consequences would be impossible to contain. What happens when reputation walks into a room before the person does? Because by the time Meghan Markle stepped into that Sundance space, she wasn't just a guest. She was a symbol, a lightning rod, a walking narrative with footnotes, opinions, and assumptions already attached. And that matters more than anyone wants to admit. This chapter isn't about what was said in that hallway. It's about what was expected before a single word was spoken. Because long before voices were raised, something else had already arrived ahead of her. Anticipation, not excitement, not hostility, anticipation mixed with caution. The kind that makes staff double-check emails, reread protocols, and rehearse responses they hope they won't need. Here's the uncomfortable truth about high-profile appearances at events like Sundance. The real work starts before the person shows up. Calendars are adjusted. Security layers multiply. Access is negotiated quietly. Expectations are inferred rather than stated. And with Meghan Markle, those expectations were complicated. To some inside Sundance, her presence represented relevance. Global headlines. Proof that the festival still mattered in a celebrity-saturated landscape. To others, it represented risk, not because of her personally, but because of the gravitational pull she brings with her. Media follows, scrutiny follows, interpretation follows. Nothing stays neutral. So when she arrived, staff weren't just managing logistics, they were managing potential outcomes. Every interaction felt like it could become a story. Every delay felt like it could be interpreted. Every boundary felt like it might be tested. And here's where the contradiction begins. Publicly, Meghan Markle's image is rooted in advocacy, speaking up, challenging systems, calling out mistreatment. That narrative carries power. It also creates assumptions. Some staff expected empathy, some expected assertiveness, some expected nothing at all, just another guest. But institutions don't interact with people. They interact with expectations, and expectations, once formed, shape everything. From the moment her schedule began circulating internally, subtle adjustments were made. Nothing dramatic. Just small shifts, timing tweaks, room access considerations, extra coordination. Normal? Yes. Neutral? Not quite. Because each accommodation sends a signal, and signals accumulate. By the time the event was underway, some staff felt the weight of those signals pressing down on them. Not because anyone had been rude, not because anyone had made demands, but because the margin for error felt razor thin. Have you ever worked a job where you're not afraid of doing something wrong? You're afraid of doing the wrong thing to the wrong person. That's a different kind of pressure. And it's one staff aren't trained to articulate because admitting it sounds like bias, even when it's really about survival. As the evening progressed, accounts suggest interactions were polite, professional, even warm. But beneath that surface, expectations were quietly clashing. A request here, a clarification there, a moment where someone hesitated before answering. Each one small, each one manageable, until suddenly they weren't. Here's where the stories diverge again. Some witnesses say Meghan's expectations were no different from any other high-profile guest. Others insist the tone shifted when a request wasn't immediately met. A firmness crept in. A sense of impatience, not explosive, just noticeable. But notice this, tone is subjective. Stress amplifies perception. What feels direct to one person can feel dismissive to another, especially when power dynamics are already uneven. So when that staff member said no, calmly, professionally, it didn't just halt a request. It challenged an expectation. And expectations don't like being challenged. From Meghan's perspective, this may have felt like friction where none was intended, a breakdown in communication, a misunderstanding escalated by exhaustion and time pressure. From the staffer's perspective, it may have felt like standing alone at the edge of a cliff. Who backs me if this goes wrong? That question, more than any single interaction, fueled what came next. Because when leadership stepped in, it wasn't just to resolve a disagreement, it was to answer that question decisively. You can't bully my staff. Think about how that sentence lands, depending on where you're standing. If you're staff, it's protection, validation, relief. If you're the person being addressed, it's an accusation, even if unintended, a reframing of the moment that casts everything before it in a harsher light. And if you're an institution watching from the sidelines, it's a risk, because on By the end of the week, the immediate tension had faded. Schedules moved on. Panels concluded. Applause returned. But something had shifted beneath the surface. People started watching interactions more closely, listening for tone, noting responses. Staff felt both empowered and exposed. Guests felt both welcomed and wary. And Meghan Markle's presence, once a point of excitement, had become a reference point, not because of who she is, but because of what the incident symbolized, a moment when expectations were challenged, when accommodation met resistance, when power was named instead of assumed. And that symbolism would not stay contained, because just as Sundance leadership thought the situation had stabilized, a new development began circulating, quietly at first. A detail about earlier interactions, a pattern that suggested this wasn't the first warning, a realization that this confrontation may have been the final straw, not the first crack. And once that idea took hold, it reframed everything that came before. Because if this wasn't isolated, if it was cumulative, then the real story wasn't about one argument. It was about how long it took for someone to finally say stop. And when that question surfaced, it became impossible to ignore what might come next. How many rules can bend before one finally snaps? That question hovered over Sundance long before anyone raised their voice. Long before anyone used the word bully. Long before a hallway became the most talked about room at the festival. Because protocol doesn't break all at once. It erodes, slowly, quietly, almost politely. This chapter begins where most conflicts actually start, not with anger, but with procedure, with checklists, with guidelines written months earlier by people who never imagined how much weight those pages would suddenly have to carry. By 22/6, Sundance had protocols for everything: guest movement, access levels, security buffers, staff authority. On paper, it was airtight. In practice, it was constantly negotiated. Why? Because festivals live in the gap between planning and reality, and that gap was widening. Earlier in the year, leadership had begun tightening enforcement, not loudly, not dramatically, just small internal recalibrations. Staff were reminded that exceptions required approval, that just this once needed documentation, that protecting the experience also meant protecting the people delivering it. Those reminders weren't about any one guest. They were about burnout. Volunteers quitting mid-festival, coordinators stretched across roles, assistants absorbing frustration from every direction. Protocol, for the first time in a while, was being framed not as red tape, but as protection. And protection changes the tone of everything. So when the request came in that night, the one that would later be dissected endlessly, it landed in a very different environment than it would have a year earlier. Here's what's important. The request itself wasn't outrageous. It wasn't scandalous. It wasn't unprecedented. That's why it's so easy to misunderstand what happened next. The issue wasn't what was asked. It was how often similar asks had already been absorbed. Staff had learned the pattern. A request arrives late. It requires rearranging resources. It stretches people thin. And usually, someone figures it out quietly. But this time, someone didn't. This time, a staff member followed the protocol as it was written, not as it had been flexed. They checked. They confirmed. They said no. Not defensively, not rudely, just clearly. And in that moment, the system was tested. Because rules only matter if they're enforceable. And enforceability depends entirely on what happens after someone invokes them. What followed, according to multiple accounts, was confusion more than confrontation. A pause, a recalculation, an attempt to reroute the request. That's when frustration crept in. Not explosive frustration, not visible rage. Just tension, the kind that sharpens voices and shortens patience. And this is where perception starts to split. From one angle, this was a guest navigating unexpected resistance in a high-pressure environment. From another, it was staff feeling the weight of expectation press harder than policy could support. Both experiences are real. But only one had institutional backing. At least, that was the question. Did the staff member actually have backing, or were they about to be overridden in the name of smooth optics? This is the invisible gamble staff make every time they enforce a rule. They don't know, in the moment, whether leadership will support them or quietly undo their decision to avoid discomfort. That uncertainty is exhausting, and on that night, it was unbearable. When voices rose, just slightly, it wasn't because anyone wanted a fight. It was because the situation had slipped into that dangerous zone where no one feels heard. That's when leadership intervened, not with a compromise, not with a workaround, with a statement. You can't bully my staff. Why did that line hit so hard? Because it reframed the entire interaction instantly. Before that moment, the situation could still be interpreted as logistical friction. After it, the dynamic was moral. Bullying isn't about policy, it's about power. And invoking it forces everyone to choose a side, even if they don't want to. For staff, it was validation they rarely receive. A public acknowledgement that their boundaries mattered, that their discomfort wasn't just an inconvenience to be managed away. For the person being addressed, it was jarring, because it suggested intent where there may have been none. It turned frustration into accusation, and accusations don't disappear quietly. This is where protocol stopped being about logistics and started being about identity. Sundance wasn't just enforcing rules. It was defining what kind of institution it wanted to be going forward. And that definition came with consequences. Immediately after the confrontation, there was a kind of emotional whiplash. Staff felt relief, followed by anxiety. Guests felt confusion, followed by distance. Leadership felt resolute, followed by doubt. Because drawing a hard line is easy in the moment. Living with it is harder. Behind the scenes, people began asking questions they hadn't asked before. Did we escalate too quickly? Was the language too strong? Will this change how guests engage with us? And perhaps most unsettling, what if staff start expecting this level of protection every time? That last question revealed a fear no one wanted to articulate openly. Because protecting staff shouldn't be controversial. But in environments built on flexibility and access, it often is. The reality is that many institutions rely on staff's willingness to absorb discomfort quietly. It keeps things running smoothly. It keeps reputations intact. By interrupting that pattern, Sundance created friction not just with one guest, but with an entire way of operating, and friction spreads. In the hours that followed, the incident was replayed internally in fragments, different versions, different emphases. Some focused on tone, others on timing, others on intent. What no one disputed was that the word bully had changed everything. It forced a reevaluation. Because once you label behavior, you can't unlabel it, even if it was misunderstood, even if it was situational, even if no harm was intended. Labels stick. That's why this moment mattered far beyond that hallway. It marked a point where protocol wasn't just a guideline, it was a stance. And stances invite scrutiny. The next day, leadership found themselves fielding questions they hadn't anticipated, not from press. From within, staff wanted clarity. What constitutes crossing the line? What protections exist? What happens if a guest pushes back again? Those questions didn't have easy answers. Because the truth is, institutions often rely on ambiguity to function. It gives them room to maneuver. This confrontation reduced that room, and that made people nervous. Meanwhile, externally, silence reigned. No public acknowledgement. No leaks, no corrections, which only intensified speculation. Because when stories don't get corrected, they grow. And as they grew, something else became clear. This wasn't just about one night. It was about accumulated tolerance, about the small compromises that had gone unexamined for too long. Protocol hadn't failed suddenly. It had been stretched gradually. And now it had snapped back. The question everyone was asking, though rarely out loud, was whether it would hold. Because once you stop bending, people notice and they react. Some with respect, some with resentment, some with quiet withdrawal. And as Sundance moved into the final stretch of the festival, it became clear that this line in the sand had already begun reshaping relationships. Invitations felt different. Conversations were more guarded. Staff watched leadership more closely than ever. And just when it seemed like things might settle, a new complication emerged, one that threatened to turn internal resolve into external conflict, because someone somewhere had started talking, not to the press, not publicly, but enough to ensure the story wouldn't stay contained. And once protocol becomes narrative, control slips away. And what came next would test whether Sundance's stance was a momentary stand or the beginning of a reckoning no one was ready for. What if the moment everyone remembers isn't the moment that actually mattered most? because the argument people would later whisper about wasn't explosive in the way rumors made it sound. There was no screaming, no dramatic gestures, no profanity echoing down the hall. That's what made it more unsettling. It unfolded in pieces, fragments, sentences that felt sharper than they sounded, pauses that stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. And that's how the argument no one was supposed to hear actually began, not with anger, but with restraint pushed too far. By the time voices became audible to people nearby, the disagreement had already been circling for several minutes. You wouldn't have recognized it as a fight if you didn't know what to listen for. It sounded like control, like insistence, like two realities refusing to align, one voice steady, clipped, holding the line. Another measured, firm, pushing back against resistance that hadn't been anticipated. The people who overheard it later struggled to describe what they felt in that moment. Not shock, not fear. Disorientation, because Sundance staff are used to tension. They're used to smoothing things over. They're trained to de-escalate, to redirect, to absorb frustration without reflecting it back. What they aren't used to is leadership stepping into the center of that tension and refusing to soften it. That's why everything slowed down. A volunteer paused mid-step. Someone with a headset stopped speaking into it. A coordinator lowered their eyes and stared at the floor, pretending not to hear what everyone else clearly could. And here's the detail that keeps coming up in accounts from that night. No one raised their voice first. The shift came when patience ran out. You could hear it in the pacing of words. Sentences got shorter, explanations gave way to repetition. The same point stated again, just slightly louder, slightly more emphatic. That's when people realized this wasn't going to resolve quietly. Because once repetition enters a conversation, it means neither side feels understood, and when power is involved, misunderstanding feels like disrespect. The hallway itself mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Not a private office, not a secure room, a corridor, a transitional space. The kind of place where conversations are meant to stay logistical and brief. Instead, it became a pressure chamber. Those close enough to hear later described a strange sense of being trapped, not physically, but socially. If they walked away too quickly, it looked suspicious. If they stayed too long, it felt invasive. So they froze. And in that stillness, the words landed harder. When leadership finally spoke, the tone didn't escalate. It narrowed. There was no accusation shouted across the space, just a sentence delivered with unmistakable intent. You can't bully my staff. People who heard it say, the room didn't explode. It collapsed inward. Because that line did something subtle but irreversible. It shifted the focus away from logistics and onto conduct, away from policy and onto behavior, away from misunderstanding and onto power. And once that shift happens, there's no neutral ground left. For the person being addressed, it was no longer about a request being denied. It was about being told they had crossed an ethical line. For everyone else listening, it was a signal. This is not going to be smoothed over. What followed wasn't a rebuttal so much as a recalibration. Voices lowered again. Words became careful, measured, as if both sides suddenly realized how much was at stake. This wasn't a private disagreement anymore. It had witnesses. And witnesses change everything. Some accounts suggest there was a brief attempt to clarify intent, to reframe what had been said, to assert that no harm was meant. That frustration had been mistaken for pressure. Others insist the clarification never fully landed, that the framing had already solidified and there was no walking it back. Here's the uncomfortable part no one likes to admit. Once leadership uses language like that, intent becomes irrelevant. Because power doesn't operate on what you meant. It operates on what was felt. And the feeling in that hallway was unmistakable. Something had crossed a threshold. What's often overlooked in retellings is what didn't happen next. There was no apology demanded. No punishment issued. No staff member dragged into the spotlight. Instead, the conversation ended the only way it could, with distance. Someone stepped back. Someone else turned away. The hallway slowly repopulated with movement, but the atmosphere never fully recovered, and the silence afterward was deafening. Staff didn't rush to debrief. They didn't huddle and whisper immediately. Many went back to their tasks as if nothing had happened, because that's what survival in these environments looks like. You process later, you perform now, but later did come. In break rooms, in late-night texts, In quiet, careful conversations that began with, "Did you hear that too?" What people were trying to understand wasn't just what had been said, it was what it meant. Because if leadership was willing to confront a global figure over staff treatment, what did that signal for the future? Was this an exception? Or a new rule? That uncertainty rippled through the festival like an aftershock. Some staff felt emboldened. For the first time, they believed that boundaries might actually be enforced, that they weren't alone when things got uncomfortable. Others felt exposed, because visibility cuts both ways. If leadership steps in publicly, it also draws attention to situations staff might prefer to handle quietly. And then there were those who felt uneasy, because they understood how quickly narratives turn. Today's stand can become tomorrow's liability. Meanwhile, the person on the other side of that confrontation disappeared from the immediate orbit of the festival. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just absent. No lingering conversations, no casual follow-ups. And that absence became its own message. People began asking questions they hadn't dared to ask before. Was this going to affect future invitations? Would this change how high-profile guests engage with Sundance? Had leadership underestimated the fallout? Those questions stayed internal. For now, externally, the festival remained polished. Panels went on. Applause filled rooms. Social media showed smiles and stage lights, but beneath that surface, everyone knew something fundamental had shifted. Because arguments like this don't stay contained. They get interpreted, they get retold, they get weaponized, and as days passed, a new tension emerged, not between guests and staff, but within Sundance itself. Some insiders quietly wondered whether the language used had been too strong, whether it had escalated a situation that could have been diffused differently. Others argued the opposite, that anything less would have signaled weakness. That internal divide mattered more than anyone realized. Because when leadership fractures internally, the next confrontation becomes inevitable. And that's where this story takes a darker turn. Because as the festival moved toward its final days, whispers began to circulate that this argument wasn't just being discussed informally, it was being documented, emails, notes, internal summaries. And once moments like this enter official records, they stop being fleeting incidents. They become precedents. The question was no longer whether the argument had happened. It was how it would be remembered, and by whom. Because whoever controls that narrative controls what happens next. And just as Sundance leadership began to realize the weight of what they'd set in motion, something unexpected happened. The story didn't leak to the press. It leaked sideways, to other festivals, to industry gatekeepers, to people who didn't need details, just implications. And those implications carried a warning. Something had changed at Sundance. And the industry was watching closely to see whether it would hold. Why did that one sentence echo louder than anything else said that night? Because in Hollywood, words like that don't just describe behavior. They redraw maps. You can't bully my staff. Strip away the emotion, the context, the personalities, and what you're left with is something far more dangerous than an argument. A declaration. Not of policy, of values. And once values are spoken out loud, they stop being flexible. That's why this line didn't just end a confrontation. It detonated a chain reaction. Up until that moment, everything could still be rationalized. Miscommunication, stress, logistics spiraling under pressure, the usual festival chaos. But once that sentence entered the air, the frame shifted. This was no longer about a request denied. It was about conduct. It was about power. It was about who was protected and who wasn't. And that distinction matters more than people realize. If you've ever worked in an environment where hierarchy is invisible but absolute, you know how rare it is to hear someone in authority say those words, especially to someone who doesn't technically work for them, especially in a space that survives on relationships. That's why people froze, because everyone in that hallway understood the implication immediately. This wasn't being handled quietly. This wasn't being absorbed. This wasn't going to disappear. It was a line in the sand. And lines force reactions. Some staff members felt something close to relief wash over them. Not joy, not triumph. Relief. The kind you feel when someone finally says the thing you've been swallowing for years. Others felt panic, because if leadership was willing to confront a high-profile figure like that, what would the fallout look like? Would it come back on the staff anyway, just later, more subtly? Hollywood has a long memory when it wants to. For the person on the receiving end of that sentence, the effect was different, but no less jarring. Regardless of intent, the moment had been reframed. Whatever had been said before was now being interpreted through a new lens. And once that happens, every gesture becomes evidence. Every word becomes loaded. That's the danger of moral language in professional disputes. It doesn't invite negotiation. It demands alignment. And alignment, in this context, meant accepting that a line had been crossed, or rejecting the framing entirely. Neither option is comfortable. Accounts from people nearby suggest there was a brief pause after the sentence was spoken. Not silence exactly, more like recalibration, as if everyone involved was reassessing not just the conversation, but the consequences of continuing it. Because continuing meant escalation, and escalation in that environment would have been catastrophic. So the moment ended the only way it could, with restraint. No apology was extracted. No argument won, no resolution announced, just distance. But distance doesn't neutralize impact. It concentrates it. In the minutes that followed, people dispersed physically, but the energy lingered. Staff returned to their posts, but their focus was fractured. Leadership moved on to other obligations, but their expressions had changed. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and now everyone had to live with it. The first ripple came almost immediately. Staff began quietly checking in with one another, not gossiping, not celebrating, just verifying. Did you hear that? Did I imagine it? Was that really said? When multiple people confirm the same moment, it stops being anecdotal. It becomes real. And once it's real, it starts shaping behavior. Staff who had been hesitant earlier in the festival found themselves more grounded, not emboldened to challenge, but steadied, less likely to override their own instincts, more likely to pause before accommodating something that felt wrong. That subtle shift matters, because institutions don't change through grand announcements. They change through thousands of small decisions made differently. But not everyone felt comforted. Some staff worried the statement had painted a target on their backs, not publicly, but professionally. Would guests become less patient, less cooperative? Would staff now be seen as difficult rather than protected? Those fears weren't irrational. In industries built on access, reputation travels quietly. And then there was leadership. Internally, reactions were mixed. Some saw the statement as overdue, a necessary correction in a culture that had normalized overextension. Others worried about precedent, because once you frame an interaction as bullying, you invite scrutiny, not just of the guest, but of the institution itself. What defines bullying? Who decides when a line is crossed? What happens when interpretations differ? Those questions didn't have clear answers, and ambiguity makes organizations nervous. In the hours after the incident, internal conversations turned reflective, not accusatory, analytical. The kind of discussions that happen when people know something significant has occurred, but aren't sure yet what it means. Was the language too strong? Was the intervention timed correctly? Would a different approach have achieved the same protection without the same fallout? There were no unanimous answers, because protecting staff and maintaining relationships aren't always aligned goals. And Sundance had just prioritized one over the other, publicly, even if unintentionally. That choice would ripple outward. The next ripple came from silence. No public acknowledgement followed. No clarification. No internal memo summarizing the incident. Leadership didn't try to control the narrative, at least not visibly. That restraint was intentional, because addressing it publicly would have amplified it, and ignoring it entirely allowed the festival to continue without drawing attention. But silence is not absence. It's interpretation deferred, and deferred interpretation almost always returns louder. Outside the immediate circle, rumors began to form. Not wild speculation, restrained, careful whispers. The kind industry insiders trade when they know something happened but don't yet know how to describe it. The sentence itself traveled faster than context. You can't bully my staff. Detached from tone. Detached from nuance. Detached from circumstance. On its own, it sounds heroic, principled, necessary. But stripped of context, it also sounds accusatory, final, uncompromising. And that duality is why it mattered so much, because people could project whatever they needed onto it. Supporters saw leadership. Critics saw overreach. Observers saw risk. and the person at the center of it all said nothing. That silence became the next chapter of the story. Some interpreted it as grace, a refusal to engage in backstage drama. Others saw it as dismissal, a signal that the accusation didn't merit response. Inside Sundance, staff debated whether silence was strategic or uncomfortable, whether it protected everyone or left too much unsaid. And leadership, for all its resolve in the moment, now faced a different challenge. How do you stand by a line you drew without turning it into a wall? Because institutions that draw hard lines often discover they've boxed themselves in. Every future interaction becomes a test, every future complaint becomes a precedent, and every future decision is measured against the moment you said out loud what you would not tolerate. That's when the longer-term consequences began to surface. Invitations for future events were discussed more cautiously, guest management protocols were revisited, staff training shifted subtly, emphasizing clarity over accommodation. None of this was announced, but everyone felt it. The culture had shifted a notch, and culture shifts are irreversible. What made this particularly volatile was the timing. Sundance was already under scrutiny. Questions about its relevance, its identity, its ability to balance independence with celebrity influence were circulating. This incident poured fuel on those conversations because it symbolized a deeper tension. Was Sundance reclaiming its values, or was it alienating the very figures that kept it visible? Those questions divided opinion sharply, and divisions don't stay contained. As word of the incident reached other festivals, other institutions began paying attention, not because of the personalities involved, but because of the principle. Could this happen here? Would we handle it the same way? What if our staff expected similar backing? Those were uncomfortable questions, because backing staff sounds noble until it costs you something. And Sundance was about to find out what that cost might be. As the festival drew closer to its end, the immediate tension faded, but the aftershocks didn't. People watched leadership more closely. Guests adjusted expectations. Staff tested boundaries cautiously. Everyone was waiting for the next moment, because moments like this don't stand alone. They set patterns, and the pattern that had just been established was this: staff protection was no longer theoretical. It was spoken. And once spoken, it demanded consistency. The problem? Consistency is the hardest thing to maintain when pressure returns. And pressure was coming, because just when Sundance thought the worst was behind them, something unexpected surfaced, something that reframed that sentence yet again. Evidence. Not recordings, not leaks. Documentation. Notes, emails, summaries written in the aftermath. And once a moment like this enters official records, it stops being a story. It becomes history, and history has consequences. What happens when the story you thought ended refuses to stay in the past? Because by the time the week wrapped at Sundance, it was clear the confrontation had left a mark. Not on the festival's schedule, not on panels, not on the red carpet smiles. It left a mark in perception, fragile, shifting, impossible to ignore. The word bully had been spoken. That sentence alone had shifted the entire backstage dynamic. And now, days later, everyone was reckoning with its implications. Some staff felt a quiet empowerment. For the first time, they believed boundaries could be enforced, that their concerns weren't just theoretical, that they weren't invisible. Others felt exposed, because once leadership publicly, or semi-publicly, defends staff, it casts every interaction in a new light. Every guest, every request, every negotiation is suddenly evaluated not just on logistics, but on ethics. And that's when the real complication emerged, because Hollywood is obsessed with narrative, with optics, with who said what and who was on which side. And when a statement like, "You can't bully my staff," exists without immediate context, it begins to take on a life of its own. It leaked sideways, quietly at first, but inevitably, to insiders, to peers, to other festival organizers. And in those whispers, the story began to mutate. Suddenly, Sundance wasn't just a festival anymore. It became a case study, a cautionary tale, a headline in waiting. And that's when the pressure shifted back on leadership. Because it's one thing to stand up for your staff in a hallway with witnesses, it's another to have that stance interpreted by the broader industry, by competitors, by Hollywood at large. Was Sundance brave? Was it reckless? Or was it simply the first crack in a long hidden tension that everyone had sensed but never named? Inside the festival, internal meetings were convened. Not to apologize, not to reverse the statement, but to strategize, to frame, to ensure that this one night didn't spiral into something uncontrollable. And yet, even as they tried to contain it, the story had already begun its own trajectory. Guests, staff, and leadership alike began replaying the hallway encounter in fragments. What was said, how it was said, who said it first, what it implied, and somewhere in those fragments, the narrative transformed from